My little story starts some 47 years ago. I used to be a local boy here in Townsville doing a plumbing apprenticeship. And at the time, my brother, who was 5 years older than me, I was 16, nearly 17, he was a bit of a hippy-dippy sort of person living in New South Wales, and he went to Alice Springs to find camels, or actually to find donkeys. And he stumbled across a guy called Noel Fullerton, and Noel introduced him to camels, and the first modern day camel movement started. So from that, Greg walked from Alice Springs to a place called Golgong in New South Wales, which is just near Mudgee. It was about a 2,500 kilometre walk. Took him 6 months, and when I was 17, I did a fair whack of that with him. I probably did about 1,000, maybe 1,500 kilometres. And it was 5 camels, 30 donkeys and 17 horses and 2 Aboriginal blokes from Hermansburg community. And it was quite the epic trip, let me tell you. Lots of different weird, wonderful things happened on that. Anyway, that trip finished. Much fanfare and all sorts of wacko-the-diddlo things. And then Greg met up with this guy called Tom Bergen, who was the curator of mammals of Taronga Park Zoo, and he was a high-level vet, you know, very political type vet, and they concocted this story of let's retrace Burke and Wills, and Tom wanted to write a PhD on the theory of Burke and Wills, what was right, what was wrong, blah, blah, blah. And the idea got born and away they all went, but Greg managed to contact leukemia, and he died 12 months later of leukemia when he was 23, something like that, I think 24 maybe. And when that happened, he said, well, how about you do the trip, you know? And I sort of thought, you got to be kidding, you know? I didn't have a bloody clue about camels. And I was just turning 19. So anyway, I got roped into it with Tom. We drove back out to Hermansburg and got Nugget and Frankie, his son, and we dragged them back to Golgong. And then we'd assemble the mob and all the camels, and we drove up to the dig tree on the Coopers Creek there, and our little venture began. You know, I didn't know Tom very well, he didn't know me very well, I had virtually no experience at all in walking across the desert, and we're about to head off on a 3,500 kilometre walk across Australia to prove Burke and Wills were right. Now the big thing with Burke and Wills is Burke had this theory they could go from the dig tree to the Gulf and back in 3 months, and he said to his backup crew, if I'm not back in 3 months, you're to leave and go back. Our trip was to prove that correct, that it could be done in the 3 months. So we were to go from the dig tree to the Gulf and back in 3 months. Burke and Wills were hopeless, so the worst explorers Australia's probably ever seen. And there's endless stories about how hopeless they were. Burke was the wrong person, Wills was not too bad, King and Gray were the other two, and the whole fiasco of it was a disgrace. Anyway, they never got back in the 3 months, and the backup crew waited another 7 weeks, I think it was, and then Burke came back. Burke and Wills got back from the Gulf, missed them by 7 hours, and it was a fiasco where Burke and Wills died. Gray was killed, as the theory goes, up on the trip from Burke, blah, blah, blah. King was the only survivor. Anyway, our adventure was to prove that was possible to do. So we headed off with our little camels across the stony desert to Birdsville, and Nugget and managed to get blind drunk in Birdsville and caused all sorts of chaos one night, you know, coming into the camp drunk, trying to kill his son, and it was a huge learning curve for me at 19, I can tell you. We stayed 3 days there, then headed further up the track, and all sorts of things went wrong. Camels had pack sores, and Tom and I had trouble getting on with each other. We weren't in the same social field, shall I say. Tom was this high-level guy, and I was a bum from a 19-year-old kid that didn't have a bloody clue. Anyway, we got to the Gulf, and we were 7 days out of the halfway split, so if we'd turned around and gone back, we wouldn't have got back to the dig tree in the 3 months. Now, at the same time, the ABC were with us, the Big Country were following us, and they did their 200th Big Country on the whole expedition that we did. And National Geographic from America came out as well and did a story on us, but more on the trip, on the people that were living along the route of Burke and Wills, and they ran a feature story in the American National Geographic. Anyway, that was all fine. We got to the Gulf, and Tom got blind drunk in the Normanton Hotel that night and got king hit by a local who took a great dislike to him. And it caused all sorts of trouble, you've got no idea. So we had to drag Tom upstairs. He wanted to kill this guy. This guy was going to smash him up with a glass. It was out of control. Anyway, we dragged Tom upstairs to the top of the pub there and threw him in this room. An old nugget who'd been blind drunk nearly every town that we'd come through. He decided he was going to be the responsible person that night, and he sat outside Tom's room, bolt upright against the door so Tom couldn't get out of the room he was staying in, and said, "Don't worry, Paddy, I'll look after him. You go and have a drink." So we went and had another couple of drinks and came back up and rolled our swags out on the veranda and waited for Tom to get up in the morning. And then Tom got up in the morning and said, "I'm leaving." And he got the next plane out that day and flew back to Sydney. And I was left with 2 Aboriginal guys, 10 camels, and I think $10, and I was 19. So that's when the learning curve got much more accentuated. I didn't really know what to do. The film crew looked after me a little bit. They gave me some money and helped me do a few things. So we went back to Mount Isa. Then I put the Nugget and Frankie on the bus to go back to Alice Springs. And then I hitchhiked back to Alice Springs, then took them out to Hermannsburg, and then came back to Alice Springs, hitchhiked back to Mount Isa. And then somehow or another, I got a taxi ride to the edge of Mount Isa, and I was telling this lady, the taxi driver, the story, and I paid her the money. It must have been the only money I had, and I would have looked absolutely filthy too. And I had really long hair and got no idea. Anyway, the taxi took off, and she came back and handed me $20. And I thought, "What's that about?" She said, "You can't do this." And she handed me this money. So somehow or another, I had enough money then to go back into the airport, and I flew to Townsville. Airfares were pretty cheap back then. Flew to Townsville, talked to my mother, and we lived down here in Purvis Street in Hyde Park. And I talked to her, and then I hitchhiked back up to Normanton, and then I walked from Normanton to here with the camels and disbanded. Now, Tom had already gone home. Nobody knew what was going on there. And my uncle, who was the local doctor here, Dr. Douglas, apparently they caught up at a wedding at the Gold Coast a month or so later, and Tom was the hero. Everybody was, "Oh, Tom, you've done this Burke Will stuff." And he's telling this story to all these people at the wedding, what a hero he was. And Uncle Gavin said, "And did you tell them you left a 19-year-old boy up there with $10 and and it was very embarrassing. Tom wrote a book on it called In the Steps of Burke and Wills, the Burke and McHugh Expedition. There's a couple of different books released on it. National Geographic ran their story. The 200 big country was a huge success and quite popular and all that sort of stuff, I got back to Townsville. I walked down the camels down the main street here, up through there, and I even stopped the church at Hyde Park. The Monsignor Vanderloo had a little bit of a meltdown when I walked the camels past the church, and brought all the congregation out, and they waved to me as I walked past. It's kind of funny. That's my church where I was an altar boy. And then my mother bought me a truck, and we made this crate up out of bloody steel from the tip and bits of corrugated iron, and I put the camels in the truck, and we drove back to Golgong, and we had a few little mishaps on the way. So it was. I think I was away nearly 5 months. It was just, parts of it I remember, parts of it I don't. But it was certainly an education to me and made me grow up at 19. Good God, what do you do at 19? I don't know what you were all doing at 19, but it was certainly an education. Anyway, from that, camels became a bit of a way of life for me, and we did racing displays at the Sydney and Melbourne Royal Agricultural Shows. We used to dress up as Arabs and charge around the track and look like idiots. And I've exported camels to numerous places around the world, to United Arab Emirates, to Korea, Japan, various places. And we now sit on a couple of different international committees with camels. So I started the Boulia camel races. We did the 1988 camel race from Ayers Rock to the Gold Coast, all sorts of weird and wonderful things. And myself and my wife now sit on this committee. So we tend to rub shoulders a little bit with princes and sheikhs and maharajas, and it's all through camels. It's really a weird connection. I've sat in the dirt with the poorest of the poorest people in the central deserts of Australia, and I've sat in the majlises and the palaces in Saudi Arabia just through the camel connection. And we now sit on this committee called the International Camel Racing Federation, which is the royal families or the Saudi Arabian government's committee, where they will in the next few years bid for the Olympics, and camel racing will be their chosen sport. So watch that space, it's coming. You can see what they're doing now, it's happening. So camels have been very rewarding to me. I've had a fabulous time through them. I've met some fascinating people through them, and it's been a way of life, it really has. And I've learnt a lot. I've learnt a lot to be humble. I've learnt to sort of sit in places and pay attention and when you're sitting in a palace in Abu Dhabi or whatever, it's a head spin, to say the least, you know. We have all sorts of other plans with camels as well, so the time ahead, we'll see what happens.